We will now look at how the flight guidance achieves its automatic thrust control function, the Autothrust system or Autothrust. The Autothrust can work in two different modes. Speed mode. The Autothrust continuously adjusts the thrust in order to maintain a target speed or Mach, e.g. during cruise or approach. Thrust mode. The Autothrust sets a given thrust, e.g. max climb or idle. The Autothrust modes are automatically linked to Autopilot Flight Director vertical modes. When Autopilot Flight Director vertical mode controls a trajectory, e.g. altitude hold, vertical speed, glide slope, the Autothrust is in speed mode. When Autopilot Flight Director vertical mode adjusts the aircraft pitch in order to keep a target speed or Mach, e.g. climb, descent, the Autothrust is in thrust mode. The main autothrust controls available to the pilots are the thrust levers. On the Airbus fly-by-wire family, the autothrust does not backdrive the thrust levers while it adjusts the thrust. Let's have a closer look at them. Note, we will use the A330 thrust levers for this presentation, the A340 levers working exactly in the same way.
When the autothrust is off, the crew controls the thrust as usual by moving the thrust levers over a quadrant. For forward thrust, this quadrant carries 4 physical detents or stops, which are idle, climb for maximum climb thrust, flex, MCT for flexible thrust at takeoff, or maximum continuous thrust, and toga for max takeoff or go-around thrust.
The autothrust can only work when the thrust levers are set forward of the idle detent and up to the climb detent, or MCT detent in case of engine failure. If the thrust levers are set by the pilot in the reverse position, the autothrust cannot operate. Note, the alpha floor function is an exception which will be covered later on. When autothrust is on, the thrust lever position determines the maximum thrust which can be commanded by the autothrust, for example, to accelerate in speed mode. On the thrust gauge, that we will talk about in the engine chapter, the thrust lever position is indicated by a symbol. It materializes the maximum thrust available to the autothrust for normal operation. The autothrust has 3 states. It can be either disconnected or off, armed, ready to be set to on by a specific pilot action on the thrust levers, active or on. Let's see these states in more detail. We are taxiing to the runway. Because we are on the ground, the autothrust is necessarily disconnected. This is confirmed by the absence of any autothrust-related indications on the FMA, and by the extinguished autothrust push button on the FCU. Thrust is manually adjusted by the crew as required to taxi the aircraft. You are cleared for takeoff. The pilot flying must manually set the thrust levers to flex or toga to initiate the takeoff roll. Click on the thrust levers to initiate the takeoff roll. No, click on the thrust levers to initiate the takeoff roll. No, click on the thrust levers to initiate the takeoff roll. As soon as the thrust levers are set in the toga detent, the FMA shows Autothrust blue, indicating that autothrust is armed. Manual toga white, indicating that the pilot manually controls the thrust via the thrust levers set in toga. Note, toga is the maximum thrust available for takeoff. At the same time, on the FCU, the autothrust push button light illuminates in green. The fact that the autothrust is armed means that it is ready to be turned on by a pilot action on the thrust levers. Note that when the autothrust is armed, the pilot has manual control on the thrust with the thrust levers. Crossing the thrust reduction altitude, thrust red altitude, the pilot must manually set the thrust levers to climb detent. On the FMA, a flashing lever climb prompts the pilot to set the thrust levers back into climb detent. Set climb thrust now. Click on thrust levers to set climb thrust. Notice on the FMA, autothrust white indicates that the autothrust is on. Thrust climb green indicates that the autothrust is in thrust mode. Since the thrust levers are set in the climb detent and the autopilot commands a climb mode, the autothrust commands thrust climb. The white boxes around the modes highlight the fact that a mode change has occurred on the FMA. Note, the Autopilot 1 vertical mode adjusts the pitch to maintain the takeoff schedule target speed. In normal operation, when autothrust is on, the levers are left in the climb detent throughout the flight until the flare. The autothrust adjusts the thrust as required between idle and max climb, but the thrust levers, not being back-driven by the autothrust, remain in the climb detent as set by the pilots. Crossing the acceleration altitude, ACC altitude, the FM climb phase is initiated. The autothrust maintains climb thrust, while the vertical mode, climb, adjusts the pitch to accelerate the aircraft towards the new speed target, the initial climb speed, here 250 knots. If at any moment the pilot needs some additional thrust, he will push the thrust levers forward from climb detent. He will then manually control the thrust. In that case, manual thrust is displayed in white on the FMA. Autothrust is displayed in blue, since the autothrust is armed. Whenever the pilot brings the thrust levers back into climb detent, the autothrust is automatically back on in the appropriate mode. Note that the autothrust may be on in flight, provided the thrust levers are set in between idle and climb detents, all engines operating, or in between idle and MCT, one engine inoperative. Beyond these detents, the pilot has manual control on the thrust. When the aircraft reaches the target altitude, Autopilot Flight Director switches to altitude mode, while the autothrust switches to speed Mach mode, as indicated on the FMA. In this mode, the autothrust continuously adjusts the thrust to maintain the target speed Mach. Autothrust is also in speed mode when Autopilot Flight Director vertical modes are vertical speed or flight path angle, glide slope, and generally during the approach. We are now in approach, just before flare. You manually fly the aircraft with the autothrust engaged. Note that the autothrust is in speed mode. During a hand-flown flare, the pilot has to reduce the thrust for landing. He will do so by bringing the thrust levers back to idle at about 20 feet. Note, if he does not do so, the autothrust will increase thrust to maintain the speed. A retard auto call-out comes up at about 20 feet as a reminder to retard the thrust levers. Click on the thrust levers to set them to idle.